Hello and welcome to this Blackwell online podcast. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Daisy Hill. Daisy has just published her first book, Young Romantics, in which she looks at how friendship, poetry and politics fused together in the intense relationships of the second generation of romantics, that of Byron, Shelley and Keats. In place of the familiar, tenacious cliché of the romantic poet, a solitary, tortured, isolated genius atop his craggy peak, she offers us multiple images of the romantics as communicative, gossipy, excitable, political, above all supremely sociable, as they sit together round the table, or go travelling, or indeed, and this was far from uncommon, actually move in together. Daisy is interested in the light this approach casts on the creative process, be it Byron's verses or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, perhaps the epitome of romantic creative collaboration. And she also has fascinating things to say about the role of women in these close-knit romantic circles. Before we got on to that, I began by asking Daisy about a figure who is much less known today, but in his own time was seen as absolutely central to the whole group, Leigh Hunt. Daisy takes up his story in 1813.
Well, Leigh Hunt is, in 1813, the editor of a newspaper called The Examiner, which is the leading liberal periodical of the day. And I've been trying to think about whether there's a sort of contemporary equivalent, and I can't really think of one. Possibly something a bit like The Independent just when it started, but really much more radical. So The Examiner took as its motto, "Party is the madness of the many for the gain of a few." And it was so independent it wouldn't accept advertisements. And it's founded in 1808 by Leigh Hunt and his brother John, and it makes Leigh Hunt, who writes the paper's editorial leader each week, into a liberal celebrity. Throughout the first 4 years of The Examiner's existence, the Hunts work hard to expose corruption wherever they see it. And this gets them into trouble. So there are libel actions against them. And they successfully defeat 3 libel actions between 1808 and 1812. But in 1812, their luck comes to an end when Leigh Hunt writes an editorial which is fantastically rude about the Prince Regent. So Hunt writes an editorial about him in which he describes him as a sort of fat, corrupt man who's managed to reach his 50th birthday without achieving anything. This puts him and his brother in the dock for libel. And on this particular occasion, the Attorney General and the trial judge are absolutely determined that there is going to be a guilty verdict. So they pack the jury with men who are known to be sympathetic to the prosecution, and the Hunt's trial verdict is never in doubt, and off they go to prison. So my book starts with Leigh Hunt starting his prison sentence in Surrey Jail in Southwark for 2 years. 2-year sentence and a fine of £500. But because Hunt is writing about his sentence every week in The Examiner and writing about being in prison, he obviously causes a real problem for the prison authorities. He's not very well. He's manifestly a kind of political prisoner. So they can't just have him sort of languishing in uncomfortable surroundings. So they agree to give him 2 rooms in the old prison infirmary, and they allow him to summon the decorators, which he duly does. And he turns these 2 rooms, which have a little bit of garden attached, into this kind of magical bower with rose-coloured wallpaper and Venetian blinds screening the barred windows, and a piano and books and busts of writers, and everyone comes to visit him. So instead of thinking about Leigh Hunt languishing in a prison cell, we have to think about him in 1813 at the centre of this extraordinary literary salon, where people like Jeremy Bentham come and play battledore and shuttlecock in the garden, and people like Byron come to visit. What comes out of those 2 years in Surrey Jail is Hunt's philosophy of sociability, which is broadly the idea that a group of friends can band together to talk about reform and to write about reform, and that has a political aim, and that's a political act because the government can suspend habeas corpus and send journalists to prison. But as long as you and your friends are talking about liberal ideals, nothing can prevent their gradual spread. So friendship becomes politically significant for Hunt and his friends, and that's a really, really important idea. It subsequently becomes poetically significant too, because Hunt takes the view that you can reform romanticism, you can reform poetry by writing, by being inspired by your friends and by your own surroundings. So friendship brings together poetry and politics, and as well as that, Shelley is, following the example of the first generation of romantic writers, intimately concerned with questions about how poetry can be something which can be a vehicle for reformation, how you can use it to cure a corrupt society of its ills. So friendship and politics and poetry all become linked in complex and interesting ways in those years at Surrey Jail.
And that sociability and engagement is very much not the kind of image of the romantic poet that has been bequeathed to us, is it?
It's not, no. And, well, of course, it's certainly the case that in recent years, in academic circles, the myth of the solitary romantic artist has been fairly well exploded. That myth culturally still holds real sway, and it still holds real sway in all sorts of areas of our life. So the way we think about genius and what genius looks like. When we think about what a romantic poet looks like, it's much more likely, I think, to look in the popular imagination like a kind of figure on a cliff top than it is to look like a group of friends around a piano or around a fireside. But that's partly because this image of isolated creativity comes out of the Romantics' poetry. It comes out of poems like Alastor by Shelley. It comes out of poems like Endymion by Keats or Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Byron. So they create it. And they create this image of the artist. But yet there's a real disjunction between that image and the way in which they live their own lives. And I'm very interested in that tension between solitude and sociability as the impulses for poetry and for literary creativity.
I suppose in a group biography, there is no single catalytic moment, but it seemed to me that there was great significance in the moment where Shelley meets Mary Godwin. And that relationship is absolutely central to the story you tell.
Well, they meet in the summer of 1814, because by the summer of 1814, Shelley has become great friends with Mary's father, William Godwin, who is the godfather of English political radicalism, revolutionary ideas. And Mary and Shelley haven't met to that point because Mary has been away in Scotland. But she returns to London in the early summer of 1814, at the time at which Shelley's marriage to Harriet Westbrook, his young wife, is really rapidly unravelling. And when he meets Mary, he is absolutely smitten by her. And he later tells a friend that, he says, how deeply did I not feel my inferiority? He's just never met anyone like her. She's very beautiful. She's very, very, very clever. I mean, she's more brilliant than any other woman Shelley has ever met. She's has this air of faint reserve. She keeps her ideas to herself, but yet she opens up this passionate inner self to Shelley. And crucially, she is the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. So she represents a sort of revolutionary ideal. And she's 16. And you can see it in the letters. It's a sort of life-changing moment for him and for her too. So they fall rapidly in love and they steal away for walks. And on the graveyard, near Wollstonecraft's grave at the graveyard at St Pancras Church, she declares her love for him, watched by her sister Claire, who at this stage is called Jane Claremont. And things move very rapidly from there. William Godwin is furious because although he sort of preaches that marriage is a bad idea in political justice, it turns out that by 1814 that doesn't really apply to his own daughter. Things all get rather dramatic. And in July 1814, Shelley and Mary and Claire all elope to France.